Afternoon, everybody. I'm about to tell you a wee bit about my pilot project. Thanks for letting me steal that one. What I would say is, I am Phil Storrier. You can't probably see at the top. Hope my slides are okay. I'm currently interim vice principal at Dumfries and Galloway College, and like the people that have spoken before, I became involved in this through the initial day that came together, and I thought it was really a fantastic day, and I think it was really encouraging. The most encouraging thing for me coming from the college sector was somebody saying that we wanted to look at enhancement collectively, and actually there was going to be some resource for that. And that is really quite unique. But there have been some challenges, but it's been fantastic. So I'm going to probably follow on from what Nicola said and unapologetically describe that our project so far has been messy. And I like that. I'm all right with that because to me that mirrors education. It's not linear. It doesn't follow a path. And so that would be my first bit of advice, is prepare to see what happens as you work through your project, you know, because it will evolve. We've had things like we've got Dr. Claire Mackey from UWS who came across it, got involved, had done huge bits of research and is now wanting to do some specific research to help us support. That was something we hadn't anticipated at the start. We've had colleagues joining and wanting to come into the project. So some ways, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, is you have to let that flow a wee bit. So yes, you have a plan, you have a project, but in some respects, a bit like education, let it see where it takes you. So that would be my first bit. Second bit I would say to you as you start to embark on this is I am also not a researcher. I have never done pieces of work like this. So I felt like a complete imposter, particularly when I had people like Luke, who goes to international conferences and comes from a university. That was really quite intimidating. And I remember standing up at the first session, and in my head, I'm still a curriculum manager from a college in the East End of Glasgow with university professors and various people in front of me, and it was really quite intimidating. But embrace that because I have felt nothing but support. And actually the learning that has happened has been phenomenal. I'll just mention Jennifer Lowe, who can't be here today, but Jennifer Lowe works with Nicola at New College, Lanarkshire. I think it's particularly pleasing for me that this one has been led by colleges, and I think that's really quite significant if you think about the new steps that we're in. So that's a wee bit for me, and I'll tell you about some of the challenges. But why did we focus on pedagogy? Anyone that knows me, it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, because I get really frustrated, as I intimated earlier on, that I work in an environment that our core business for me is learning and teaching in the college sector. And it was what I felt I spent least amount of time talking about. And particularly as you move into maybe more management roles, it becomes less and less prominent in your conversations. I also feel it's a tricky topic. It's a tricky topic with teachers, lecturers, or we assumed it was going to be a tricky topic because sometimes it can maybe feel like quite a secretive practice. It can sometimes feel as if people are a bit scared. And particularly what we were finding in the initial conversations within the room was that there was lots of assumptions made. There was lots of assumptions about the pedagogy that happens at a university. There was a lot of assumptions about what happens in a college. And what clicked with me on that day was that we don't really know, because we haven't really explored it. And quite often that has a significant impact on students, particularly transitioning students, and I did it myself. And an HNC, HND student, and you've got a lecturer telling you what university is going to be like on this course that they've never been on, and they hadn't been at university in 30 years, if ever at all. So the practice that was happening was littered with assumptions, so it was important for us that we started to explore that, and I thought, let's take it on. Let's tackle it. Let's work with lecturers. Let's work with lecturers across tertiary, but also let's work with students to really get into this and understand what would help those transitioning students. It's already been covered a million times about it being a key milestone, particularly around non-traditional entrants and the challenges. And I'm not going to explore that. That's been covered today, and everyone knows. But I think the bit that for me was missing was, what did we know or understand or didn't know and understand about well thought out, coherent, student-centred practices that are already happening in institutions, that are probably happening in programmes, but that are maybe not being brought together, that are not being analysed, and most importantly are not being shared in a purposeful way. And the concern for me there is that what happens is students coming into college, students transitioning into university, in some respects, there will be some form of a pedagogy lottery, if you like. Yeah, that expectation of what happened on my HND engineering to what's going to happen in my degree. And surely there's something that we can bring. So that was what we wanted to understand, and we wanted to get into the bones of learning and teaching. So you can imagine that brings challenges. The overview of the project, so that's how it came about. I'm pleased to say that we have had 5 key partners who are remaining consistent partners within that, and it talks to Nicola's point about the importance of that, because actually without those partners round the table, it would have been really easy to go, this is not going to do anything. This is not going to do anything. And I think I was particularly pleased that when we got to our second workshop, that all those partners turned up again. And that was particularly pleasing, thinking we must have done something well. But a really nice mix, both in terms of institutions, colleges, universities, but also in terms of geography. The other benefit of having those partners and that commitment is we've got a range of people in different roles across organisations in there. So yes, this is about pedagogy, but it's about lecturers. We've had students in the rooms. We have curriculum and programme managers, because that is absolutely critical. We've got people who are vice principals, and we've got people in a range of roles, because actually this is not necessarily just about understanding practice that happens in classrooms, but understanding how that's facilitated and supported. So the basic plan of our project was we understood that we had to do a wee bit of research. We had to think, right, these are the assumptions we have, but what is known and what is out there in terms of research. We have led some initial workshops. I would say we're about halfway through what we plan to do in terms of that evaluation and analysis stage. We plan to run some workshops, and then probably the most testing bit, but the most exciting bit is we want to really go into some live practitioner inquiry. Okay, so what we are looking to do is actually support practitioners on the ground by developing tools. And I always talk about this rather simplistically, in that for teaching staff to understand pedagogy and transitions, fancy documents are great, words on a wall are fantastic, but most lecturers I know and teaching staff I talk to, they want something they can take into that class tomorrow to support those students that they see are maybe becoming disengaged for a number of reasons. So we really want to produce something practical, designed and shaped by teaching staff and students for teaching staff and students to improve the learning. And then we plan to do some evaluation. My first point is, again, mirroring Nicola's, really ambitious in terms of what we want to do. And once you get into the nuts and bolts of it, you start to realise the challenges. The biggest challenge I've found around this is people are doing this on top of their job, doing it across institutions and doing it across from Dundee down to Dumfries brings real challenges in terms of bringing people together. What we settled on as well, we felt it was really important at the outset to bring people physically together into a room to really discuss and do about that kind of sense making as a collective. And as we move forward into that practical practitioner piece, we will hope to then utilise more of technology in terms of bringing people together more frequently and for shorter spells. And then we plan to do some evaluation. So in terms of what we are trying to do, first thing was to evaluate commonalities and differences in practice. And we plan to produce some advice and guidance that would support the Transitions Review Guide. The second thing we're trying to do is lead effective collaboration with FE and HE practitioners and students to identify and raise awareness of transitional challenges. So this is to try and develop a deeper understanding for tertiary staff of the changing needs of students. We're really clear that it became quite contentious around what were we trying to do, and this came up through the discussions. We were not trying to pit college and university against each other. We were not trying to suggest that colleges are better because universities are not great because, and that comes back to those assumptions. So what we've been trying to do is bring those staff together to understand to what extent some of those assumptions are true. And some of the assumptions we had have proven to be true through staff research and student feedback. Some of them have not. But what was particularly clear was immediately as you brought people together, the light bulb moments of sharing that practice that was happening and understanding those challenges. One thing on this, what I would say has been particularly difficult, and this is maybe a wee bit of advice, is at times I probably have struggled in terms of keeping it really focused on the theme. And our theme is around pedagogy. And quite often when you get into these conversations about students and transitions, it wandered off into the broad conversations around support and funding and well-being. And we are not trying to diminish that, but what we try to make a point of doing is this is about teaching practice. What we're trying to focus on is the thoughts of that lecturer in the room working with HND students that are going to transition to university, the thoughts for those university lecturers who are teaching and receiving those students, and how can we help both of those people to become more aligned and coherent so that for the students we remove that lottery idea. There is greater certainty of the practices that I will experience, and therefore I will have the skills because I've learned them and used them in college, and actually they feel quite similar when I move to university. Part of this is about staff. It has been about developing understanding and confidence amongst academic staff in FE and HE, and giving them confidence to share and apply. This is going to be an application. We want them to apply what they're learning and what they're sharing and tell us how that's working. So what have we done so far? Phase 1, we completed some desk-based research and sort of conceptual development. What I would say is lean on your QAA contacts. That has been absolutely invaluable. Right at the start of the project, the support from QAA around that, particularly if you've not done any enhancement work, keeping us really quite focused, giving us the parameters of what is expected, because as much there's expectations of the work we're doing, and that has been really fantastic. So that has been, initially it was John Wheeler, now it's Alison, in terms of supporting us through that process. There was a lot of work in thinking it through. There was a lot of work in understanding how you were going to do it. You want to get to the good stuff, the exciting stuff, but actually thinking through what that's going to look and feel like was really important. We developed an action plan. We developed a digital workspace, which again has its own challenges. I just thought MS Teams for everyone was the same. I thought everyone knew how to use notifications, etc. It's not, and I'm guilty of that. So, oh God, I forgot to go into that digital space. What's been really good, though, is we've been doing that between institutions. It's not solely been me at Dumfries and Galloway College doing that. New College Lanarkshire have been setting up the digital spaces for staff, etc. Work to be doing. But we created some of those spaces, and it was about identifying the partner network. We spent a wee bit of the time across institutions going, who are the key people that are going to do this and be involved in this? And we probably recognised that we needed people with some level of seniority within the institution, because actually what we were going to be asking to do was, can we free up some staff time to come and be involved? Are you going to drive this within your institution? Because everyone knows any initiative worth its salt will only happen if it's driven meaningfully through well-developed leadership. And so that is really strong, and I think actually everyone within this project from the institutions, we have people in there, and they've acted as a bit of our steering group to bounce off. What I would say particularly to Luke. Luke seems to be involved in everything in terms of QA, but he's been absolutely brilliant for us, because at times in shaping this, we've not done it before. He was a bit of a critical friend. You know, he gave us that view of what might be expected, what QA might look for, but also why are we doing this? And that's really helped keep it focused, whereas I might have lost track with that if I was on my own. In terms of November, we hosted an initial workshop and started to co-design some ideas. That was very much exploratory, and that was difficult. I mean, that was going all over the place. And it's amazing when you talk about transitions, people really want to go around about those support services and around those other aspects. Absolutely critical, but that's not what we were focused on for this project. And then we've not long hosted Workshop 2, and in Workshop 2 what we started to do was understand what have we learned, what have staff told us. Workshop 2, we brought students into the room and they told us their experiences. Wow. And that was really, really, because yes, I think huge progress has been made in learning and teaching, but actually it showed us there's still a lot of work to do, and probably some of the assumptions we had were correct, which in some ways has given us confidence to go, right, we need to now use that and take it forward. So we ran our second workshop, and now we're moving into a phase of designing how we create the practitioner inquiry and develop some of the tools that we want to do. So what we found out, if it's of any use, so in terms of the research, I guess there was a couple of key things that came out. Assumptions about students, assumptions about learning. The hidden curriculum, and probably the last bit that's rung most true from staff and students was, for students, they talked about that transition and managing workload, less staff input as they had transitioned from college, and that wasn't saying that that was a good or a bad thing. It was literally outlining that at college I had more direct contact with my lecturer than I did at university, and assessment with less support. So this real thing of, within the college environment, students felt as if they were really walked through assessment and supported, and that was not us saying that that was the right way to do it. Moving and transitioning to an experience where you're very much left on your own to work it out. So what we gained from that is we need to find some sweet spots in the middle that takes the best of both those approaches. In terms of staff, there was a lot of exploration around what makes students and staff more resilient in the learning experiences. This is not just about students' resilience, but actually what we hope to develop is staff resilience. And by that, I often refer to staff having repertoires. And actually, the bigger your repertoire of pedagogical approaches and practices, the more resilient you can be in the classroom or the lecture hall or the theatre, because actually you can better engage with diverse students. How do we reconsider contact? The big thing that came through was teach less, learn more. We talked quite clearly about lecturers and colleges and universities quite often being the hardest working person in the room. And that is not what we felt or what students was telling us was going to be effective learning. Staff's understanding and vision of pedagogy, it was quite unclear. Staff across institutions were saying, we don't really know what good is. And quite often we're not supported to develop that. They wanted to know more about where we already had innovative approaches. And then there was a bit about students' voice, living the lived experience in learning spaces. What students told us, it did come up. I haven't planted this. They said it. 2 or 3 students said it. Death by PowerPoint. And everywhere I go, myself included, we're doing it. Death by PowerPoint. And that came through time and time again. There was multiple students told us in their experiences, and this wasn't institutional, that was their experience from transitioning HN to they had fallen asleep in classes. One student, and this was profound for me, was I do most of my learning away from the class. So the question was actually, what did we want to be doing? What learning happens where? And then actually what they talked about, which gave us more confidence around what we want to work on, is a lot of them talked about they did not have the personal skills to engage in the practices that were being asked of them. So that it wasn't necessarily that the practices were incorrect. But for example, perhaps moving to, some spoke about in lectures, and just being broken out into 20-minute discussion groups, and particular students, particularly transitioning students going, I didn't have the skills to do that. Some did not. But quite often what they said, but there was no effort made to support us to develop those skills, or how could you better manage group work so that actually everyone could participate. And the other thing that came through was terminology was volatile. Understanding what we meant by strategies. And actually we tested that out with some of the teaching staff and said things like, what's your understanding of the flipped classroom? What's your understanding of X, Y, and Z? Everyone had different understandings. So the purpose of this is to try and find some commonality, but also try and find some practice. Because actually what I think is really important is that we should not be scared to talk to our students about the learning and teaching approaches that we're going to deploy. I think we're okay to say to students, actually, today, guys, we're going to try flipped classroom activities. We're going to do group work. We're going to do this. Here's what it means. Here's what it looks like. And if we can develop some of that and some shared language around that, and hopefully that would help students, because they would go, oh, I did that in my HND. I'm really confident in group work settings now because I know how I've done it. So what next? Upcoming phases and milestones. So we've kind of done a bit of the talking. And again, that has been difficult. The timeline has stretched. And that's purely because trying to find spaces to bring people, teaching staff, people in different roles from 5 institutions together in person has been challenging. So the second workshop was later than we had anticipated. But we feel we've got good grounding now in terms of what we want to frame it around. Our core message for our theme in terms of developing practices is going to be around teach less, learn more. It's going to be about student-centred pedagogies, but actually how we can support staff to deliver those effectively and confidently. So the next phase is around developing resources with shared strategies and techniques. I know that makes it sound quite simple using the word techniques, and I recognise pedagogy is not just about a bank of techniques, but this is us being really focused on saying, could we create some form of toolkit that has 20 well thought out and practice techniques that could be deployed across the HE and FE coherently. And then what we intend to do is get feedback from those practitioners to say, how did this work in the settings? And hopefully what we get to is a set of techniques and strategies that could be deployed. But I'll also not be apologising for that. This is about supporting staff to enhance a more coherent learning experience for students by giving them things they can pull out, go into a toolbox and say, I can use that tomorrow with those students, particularly understanding them. So we want to then, a bit of dissemination and shared sense making with practitioners once we've done a period of practitioner inquiry. We then plan to gather and analyse that using staff and student feedback. And then the ambition is to come out with some physical tools that we've developed. So one, we hope to come out with a teaching toolkit. We might not call it that. We've had some debate around what we discuss, but tools and strategies that staff could then use across the sector and beyond their organisations. Some guidance around what we've learned to develop for the review, and hopefully from there we will kick on into developing further practices around learning and teaching, and the hope that if we can actually align our practices, share our practices and develop common themes and language, that for students that becomes more coherent. What we've all agreed is that we need to get to a position where actually the teacher's task is to initiate the learning, support it and scaffold it, and then get out the way. Because actually students talked about they want to learn more, they want to actively engage in that learning, and that's something that definitely across the sector we can facilitate because we've got great examples of it. Thank you.
Okay, we've got some time for some questions. Does anyone have any questions for Phil?
Thank you again for this great presentation. But one quick question, please, about the standardization or the customization or personalization of the program, because here you talk about, the commonality of the terms or the terminology that we've been using here. But even we are different as university. Like if you look at, the term like course leader, you find program leader, course leader, or director across the universities. So this would be more difficult with the college. So again, how would you overcome this challenge?
So I guess the key premise of this is to develop resources for practitioners, the individual practitioner on the ground, to say this is what we've understood around students' experience and transition from learning in, say, a college and moving into university. Here are some teaching techniques and practices that we think can be effective for those students to upskill, to be engaged in the learning, to support you around that. That's where the premise of this project sits. So really it's been designed by practitioners across 4 institutions, and then the plan would be to share that across the piece. But this is really about developing a set of teaching practices, individual, 20-minute activities, 15-minute activities that can be deployed in classrooms, lecture halls, learning theatres, but feel more cohesive, so that what students are asked and the ways that they're asked to engage in learning is seamless and more coherent.
Any other questions? I knew it would be somebody on the other side of the room.
Of course it is.
Thanks very much. I just wonder if you believe that some of these teaching practices will then change the practice for lecturers at universities in general. So if they're expected to put these practices in place for transitioning students who may be coming in for year 2 or year 3, what impact would that have, do you think, on their teaching more broadly? Would you be expecting to see a change for all students, even ones that are coming in year 1?
Yeah, so I don't think we're going to stipulate. I mean, I think what we're hoping is that the practices will be designed with that in mind. But actually, probably what we're saying is that effective practice around learner-centred approaches. So more broadly, it is about that sharing of practice and understanding. So we would expect that, or we would hope to see, whether or not there's direct correlation of that. But our focus in terms of this piece of work is to understand how that had immediate impact, if any, on those immediately transitioning. I think more ambitiously, you'll see there's partnerships here, but I think there is a longer term piece in terms of how do we understand teaching practice across tertiary and more alignment for all students.
Any other questions? I'm now anticipating one on the other side of the room. Well, did we have any other questions for any of our speakers today? Because I think that we had, or has anyone got any reflections, having heard all three presentations, on anything they wanted to raise across any of the presentations? Yeah.
Hi, it's me again. I just want to actually agree with you about how important that teaching practice is, because we've just finished reading all our teaching and learning survey. Yes, and so yeah, we've gone through thousands of the comments, and actually the role of lecturer or teacher plays such a more important role than the support mechanism, because especially at the beginning when we were talking about the diversity of students, and often people assume that by, you know, it's all about putting the support mechanism. I think that is very important. You have the support mechanism, but what the students telling us is this, what really make them feel that sense of belonging is the lecturer or the teacher. So I really feel it is important to, like you say, just to concentrate on the, you know, the pedagogy and then the teaching practice, because in the EDI world that I work in, often we talk more about the support outside of the classroom, but then what I said recently in our EDI lead meeting was like, within Edinburgh College, we really need to focus more about, I know that it's not every student's going to be able to leave with a successful qualification, but that has to be our primary goal. It's not, I mean, a positive experience is very important, but at the same time, we do want them to leave with a qualification, so that, as another speaker was saying, it's about getting out of poverty. But because yesterday, just speaking to one of our ex-students to say that she actually started her business, you know, it's her business. And then I think it is about the life-changing experiences that we're giving to people, but they do need the qualifications in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think if you think to the transitioning student, I mean, I'll point you to the comments that we got from students about I fell asleep, and that was multiple times. So if you're falling asleep, now that could be because you know things, but I have other assumptions around that. But also what students are saying, things like, I've had to travel for an hour and a half to get to this lecture, for which I've done my learning out with the lecture. Now, this is not a criticism of any staff, but actually, why are we delivering that way? And actually, within my own institution, we've had a real focus on learning and teaching. But what became quite clear to me is unless you provide staff with guidance, tools and alternatives, then actually that you can't disrupt practice. You cannot just ask people to teach differently, and it should be informed by the students. But if the students are saying, well, actually, I would have really benefited from that flipped classroom idea you were talking about, but I've no idea what that was and I'd never heard of it, and we're in 2025. So to me, that's, you're right, it's really important, and this project is about keeping it really focused on that teaching practice that I think can be applied regardless of your institution and regardless of your programme.
Can you hear me? Oh, thanks for a great presentation, and I absolutely concur. If you get a chance, do dip into the pre-arrival academic reports, because when you actually look at the priorities of our students, they're not joining clubs and societies. They're academic studies. They are balancing work and study commitments and looking after the mental health. So if you use those as the focus, then actually it's how do we actually make the learning happen? Something I didn't say, we all know learning doesn't happen in lectures. It happens in the workshops, the labs, the studios. And so if you're going to monitor attendance, monitor that. And which is why, you know, lectures, you could do online. You could change the way that you deliver that type of teaching. And the other comment, and this has always made me chuckle really, universities teach the teachers. And yet we, within institutions, don't learn off the teachers who teach the teachers how students are taught in schools and colleges. That would be a really good bridging exercise to actually learn from the people who teach the teachers of what is what.
Just went right next person, just to help. You do not want the question, Phil. You had enough. I'll make it
Enough
really,
for you, Megan.
I'll make it really difficult now. No, it is a bit of a cheeky question. So you talked a lot about assumptions, and I thought that was really interesting. We've heard that from some of the other speakers today. So I'd be really interested, was there any assumptions you had of what you thought you were going to hear from the universities that changed, or anything that you managed to kind of, I don't want to say correct, but things that people assumed about colleges, but actually you were able to say it's different than you think? I'd be really interested to hear about that.
I probably had an assumption that in terms of practice, we were further apart than we actually are. So it was a really positive, challenge to that, because actually some of those ideas of student falling asleep or whatever, the inactive learning, wasn't all universities. So I think, that the assumption that colleges are really practical, hands-on, fully engaged, and universities are lecture, that assumption has been blown out the water for me, and I think, correct me if I'm, is it lectorials we have at Abertay, Luke, is that right? But there was lots of things that came out the room, you go, oh, never thought about that. So I think that was the biggest thing. I was probably surprised at how much commonality there was. And actually another thing was that the practitioners in the room, their willingness to go, I know at times this isn't great for me, but I don't have an alternative. So there was a real willingness to go, actually, we do want to do something, and we're prepared to try something different. So that willingness to really, maybe expected there to be a wee bit of a standoff in the room about practice. This is about getting students ready for university. It wasn't. Everyone was quite coherent about more engaging practice.